I'm Kristen Seefeld, and today I'm going to give you a very quick walk through the U.S. federal budget and the processes associated with it. So there's a couple of key concepts that we're going to cover during this brief overview. Revenues, expenditures, both mandatory and discretionary, authorizations, appropriations, a budget resolution, and then a continuing resolution. So first, let's talk about revenues. Revenues are really just the money that's collected by the federal government to fund itself and its services. The graph that you see shows the sources of revenues from the fiscal year 2016 budget. If you look, you can see that almost half of all federal government revenues come from individual income taxes. The next largest share are the taxes that people pay through their paychecks directly to fund the Social Security and Medicare programs. Corporate income taxes comprise about 9% of all revenues. Excise taxes, which are just taxes on particular goods, make up about 3%, and then there's another 6.5% from other sources. You can think about those as being fees, like, for example, that national parks collect. But individuals, either individuals and their households, make up the largest share of revenue that comes into the federal government. Next are expenditures. And expenditures is the money that Congress spends to fund the services and programs and itself. Expenditures are of two different types. First are mandatory expenditures, and these are for programs and functions which are automatically funded. To have this designation, a law must have been written that sets aside a certain program or function as one that must be mandatorily funded, and it will always be a mandatory funding stream unless there's some change made to the underlying law. Everything else is discretionary spending, and this is for programs and services that Congress has to authorize the funding through what is known as the appropriations process. So the process starts off with the release of the president's budget, which lays out that office's funding priorities. Congress may or may not use this budget as a starting point, but in the end, they have to pass a series of bills to authorize spending for programs that are funded via this mechanism. There's a number of concerns about the extent to which mandatory spending represents an increasing share of the overall federal budget. So right now, we've been experiencing increases in healthcare and Social Security spending in the United States. These are both mandatory programs, and they're often referred to as entitlement programs because the people who are eligible to receive that benefit are entitled to get it. So as more baby boomers retire, more people are entitled to Social Security, and the federal government must pay for those benefits. Programs that are funded with discretionary dollars usually have a fixed amount of money allocated to them. So unless Congress opts to provide more, when the money's gone, it's gone, and there's no entitlement to receive whatever those programs' benefits were. In addition to concerns about healthcare and Social Security spending, there are several other issues that represent ongoing challenges around the federal budget. First are issues around deficits and debts. With very few exceptions in modern history, the federal government has never brought in exactly as much revenue and then expended the same amount of money. That is, we've usually carry a deficit every year. So the amount of money coming in is less than the amount of money the federal government spends. Each year that you have a deficit, it means you have a negative balance. And there are some who argue that the federal government should function like a household budget, and you shouldn't be allowed to run a deficit. Others argue that running a deficit is precisely what the federal government needs to do, particularly in times when we have economic recessions and depressions. If the federal government curtailed spending, lots of people wouldn't receive services that they need. Related to the phenomenon of deficits, which is the negative balance of money, when the budgets don't balance are debts. And so the federal government can borrow money to help pay for the deficits. I'm not going to get into too much detail about this, but the basic mechanism is that the federal government issues bonds that people can purchase, as an investment, but then they can also call those due. The federal debt has been rising. You may have heard in the news many politicians get upset about this. In part, this is because over time, fewer U.S. citizens are holders of these treasury bonds, and increasingly foreign investors hold them. And there's some concern about whether or not this is good for the country. When you hear issues around deficits and debts, know that they are two separate issues, but they are very much related. A second issue that you need to be aware about are continuing resolutions. So you might remember that I said every year Congress has to pass a budget authorization. Well, that's how things are supposed to work. Increasingly, as things have been kind of contentious politically, our federal government has been funded more and more through what are called continuing resolutions. These are just sort of stopgap funding mechanisms that keep the government running and keep funding typically at levels that it had been in the past. So no new legislation necessarily gets created, no new spending bills are passed, but a continuing resolution allows the government to keep running and doing business as is. If continuing resolutions aren't passed, or if a new budget resolution is not passed, the government then will shut down. And since the 2000s, we've had a number of instances where we've had federal government shutdowns. Social workers do need to be concerned about shutdowns. They need to pay attention to what's going on in federal budget discussions. It is ultimately the federal budget that funds many of the programs and services that our clients need access to. And when the federal government shuts down, when budgets aren't passed, clients don't have access to those services, and individual social workers may find themselves laid off. So real hardship can result. So that's a very quick walk through the federal budget process. There are lots of resources out there that can provide you with more information, including the Federal Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office. Both have lots of materials that give more detailed explanations. Thank you.